Well, folks, Feast Week is getting gobbled up, and we have a ton of fantastic games to discuss today while also predicting some potential upsets that could happen over the weekend.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is up? Welcome to the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host, Andy Patton, and today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, more odds, and more lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, Leif, what an incredible game of MTEs, an incredible feast week for college basketball so far. We're only partway through it. We haven't even seen PK 85 games get going yet, but Maui gave us some just incredible games. And the Creighton, Arkansas game, the San Diego State, Arizona game, absolutely incredible. Leif, I want to start with the Creighton, Arkansas game because not only did it look like there was like somewhere between 8 and 10 NBA players playing in this basketball game, but it was just a high level affair from start to finish. I would love to hear your initial reactions from that game.
Yeah, I thought that both these teams, were 9 and 10 entering the AP poll, stayed at 9 and 10 in the second week of the AP poll. And I think you could see that both teams had the capacity to be Final Four teams.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say it was a Final Four quality of game in terms of just like the X's and O's and,
Sure.
and in terms of the pace, like because there weren't that many tactical adjustments, but in terms of the competition level, the energy, the scoring ability, and the ability to kind of win spurts of play. Like Arkansas was being outplayed in the first half, cut the deficit before half, came out guns a-blazing in the second half. And you're like, man, imagine when this team gets Nick Smith back. Okay, that's a Final Four caliber team, or at least Elite Eight. And then, of course, let's talk about the team that won it. That was Creighton. Creighton has all the weapons. Everyone knew that. Were they able to generate stops? And I think when it mattered most, they were able to dig deep and get a few stops, and they were able to be the better overall team in the first half by a margin that was wider than the second half Arkansas victory, both in terms of points and in terms of, execution and caliber of play. And you kind of see how Creighton's meshing. My question was, okay, how do you incorporate someone like Baylor Scheierman to a team that already had a few ball-dominant players? Nembhard was phenomenal. Trey Alexander is a really good two-way player. Kalkbrenner, for a while, didn't miss a shot. And like not only in that game, but just overall in this season. He's shooting close to 80% from the field. And then Arthur Kaluma, I didn't think played very well. And so, there's going to be moving pieces, but you could see just so easily, well, now you got the Creighton of old with like long bomb shooting threes, and you got this physical athletic team. And so, that was an awesome game, 90-87. Maui's known for some high scoring games, and the pace and athleticism on the court was amazing.
I was sticking with Creighton before we move on and talk a little bit more about Arkansas. This backcourt just looked phenomenal. It looked like they've been playing together forever in this game. We saw Scheierman and Nembhard combined to go 6 for 9 from deep. They went 13 of 16 from the free throw line. Like these two guys combined to score 45 points. Of course, Kalkbrenner had 21 as well. Just a phenomenal performance from this backcourt. The only thing you mentioned, Kaluma didn't play all that well. Stands to reason he's likely going to get better as the season goes on. But to me, the only thing that you would nitpick about this kind of performance, at least from watching the game, looking at the box score, 3 points from the bench, like not a ton of depth for this team, at least that didn't show up in this game. I think better days are ahead for Kaluma, certainly. But when you only get 3 points from your bench, when you get 90, or at least I guess 87 from your starting five, you're not going to complain too many times. But I wonder how much that depth could eventually impact this team in March.
Yeah, that's a good point. That I think they're expecting a big leap from Mason Miller, son of Mike Miller. King Jr. off the bench is a solid big, but he's no Ryan Kalkbrenner. And then Francisco Farabello played on the TCU team that gave Arizona all they could handle. And I don't expect big things necessarily, but you do expect more than 3 points in a 40-minute game. And then one more question I'll turn over to you is, when you watch a team like that and they've got a lot of players scoring well, and it wasn't necessarily like, okay, they need a bucket right here. Like, who are they going to go to? It never felt like that while watching the game. It was just kind of like, let's push the pace and get a good shot. And in a way, I find that really appealing because it's egalitarian. It's fun. It's entertaining. It's aesthetically pleasing. Who do you think becomes the guy they get a bucket with late? And I think there's 3 or 4 plausible answers, but I think that's a question that needs to be answered at some point for me.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because you could argue that they could have it be more egalitarian and have it be a situation where it's one or the other. But when you get down to the NCAA tournament, when you get down to like I think about like some of the best teams we've seen in the last couple of years, a lot of those teams did have multiple scores. You think about like that 21 Gonzaga team or that 21 Baylor team. Both those squads had like multiple guys, but at the end of the day, like you knew Jalen Suggs was taking the last shot, and so like you want to be able to find a guy like that. For me, it's probably Ryan Nembhard. I think he's the most likely candidate. I think Scheierman could eventually be that guy. I think it's possible he ends up taking over that kind of a role. I before the season, I would have said Nembhard. I'm still sticking with Nembhard, but watching the way that Scheierman looked just so seamlessly adapted to that offense for the Blue Jays, I think he's got a real chance at it. And then it obviously is matchup specific, but there's a real case for it to be Kalkbrenner too, depending on what you need. If you need a quick two, if he's got a matchup that you like, you just go get him the ball down low and let him go to work. I mean, like you said, it took him a while to miss his first shot in this game. So obviously he's the guy you can rely upon to put the ball in the hoop.
Yeah, and I'd make a case. I've always been high on Trey Alexander, both coming out of high school and recently. And I think in the tournament they were missing Nembhard and Kalkbrenner, and he made a very solid claim that he can be the guy. So I think this is a good thing. I always favor guards. And Creighton, they get slept on with Texas, Baylor, Houston, North Carolina, best backcourts in the country, and Creighton's right up there. And I think they made a claim for that for the world to see. Absolutely.
I want to talk about Arkansas a little bit too. And specifically, I want to talk about Anthony Black because Anthony Black looked absolutely awesome in this game. 26 points, 10 of 18 from the field, 6 boards, 6 assists, just really well-balanced attack from him. He looked phenomenal on the defensive end of the floor, hunts his own shot. Obviously playing without Nick Smith, who's expected to be, potentially the 3rd overall pick in the draft or a high level, one of the best freshmen in the entire country. For Arkansas to keep this game competitive and very close to pulling out a victory without one of their best players is certainly something to behold. But what did this game tell you more about Anthony Black or about Arkansas in general?
It told me that Arkansas is really dangerous, which I think I knew, but I didn't quite grasp that they could be this dangerous without Nick Black. I thought once he comes back, now they have more scoring options. I was dubious that they could score well enough early in the season. I thought there'd be some growing pains as players adjusted to their roles, and it would be amplified by Nick Smith being out and then kind of grabbing a role that would certainly be a dominant one. That said, I learned that Anthony Black is certainly capable of running the show, that he's a better draft prospect for someone who does the draft for Locked On NBA Big Board. I had my concerns about Anthony Black, namely his jump shot and how he'd be able to create in terms of athleticism against the top-tier athletes. While Creighton is a very good basketball team, I wouldn't say their backcourt's full of top-tier athletes, but that said, he certainly eradicated my overarching concerns. And the way he's able to put pressure on a defense, and Arkansas is able to attack off of closeouts and get out and run, and they've got superb athletes that finish above the rim. And I think as the season goes along, they'll get better defensively. Obviously, they lost Jalen Williams, who was the heartbeat of their defense last year. And I think once they get better on defense, this is a team that can truly compete. And I don't think that's a surprise for those of us who follow college basketball that they made the Elite Eight 2 years in a row. But I do think the speed at which they're getting better is alarming for college basketball as a whole, because last 2 years they've struggled both of the years, found their identity late, and then cruised through March Madness. This year they had higher expectations, but their best player, according to paper, Nick Smith, isn't playing, and you'd expect them to take a larger role into, oh man, they must be struggling. But I almost came out more impressed by them than Creighton, even though Creighton won, and I bet on Creighton. So that says a lot about Nick Smith and his ability to conduct the ship for Arkansas.
Well, I think that's a really nice segue, Leif, into talking about some of the prospects that we've seen early in the season. It's not even Thanksgiving yet, or it's Thanksgiving as many people are listening to this. And so there's still so much season left to be had. But there are certainly some players whose stock has risen, whose stock has potentially dropped. And I kind of want to explore that with you in the second segment. But before we do that, I want to tell you all about BetOnline. College basketball and the NBA are back in action, and college football and the NFL remain in the thick of their seasons. BetOnline.net is your number one source for all of your betting needs and sports information. From all the latest odds, contests, and player props, you name it. BetOnline remains the best spot for all the latest sports developments, including podcasts and reviews for all of the leagues this season. And it's not just basketball. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sports wagering information needs, including live betting and your favorite Vegas casino games. They even have lines for coaching changes across every major sport. So even in the offseason, you can get your fix. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, segment 2, still talking here with Leif Tulane of Locked On NBA Big Board. Very excited, Leif, to get your thoughts on a couple of players who have perhaps bumped their draft stock, perhaps lowered their draft stock. Again, it's always a constant ebb and flow in this situation, and ultimately draft stocks are often determined after the season and with performances either in March Madness or, of course, at the NBA Combine. But certainly we've seen some players who have kind of surprised us a little bit in some good and bad ways. I want to start with you and talk about a player that you have seen so far this season who's maybe boosted their draft stock from where you had them at the start of the year.
I think the main one is Anthony Black, as we were talking about. So I'll briefly touch on him and kind of branch out there, so we don't harp on him too much. But Anthony Black's concerns were his jump shot and his athleticism in the half court, and both of those he passed with flying colors. Jump shot, he hit 4 threes over 2 games in Maui. I wanted to say the Maui Jim, but I think it's the Maui Jim again.
Yeah, it is.
But anyway, Anthony Black is facilitating the pressure he puts on a defense is really impressive. And that for someone who studies the draft, you sometimes wonder what can a player do to improve his stock. That is something that'll be translatable to an NBA court. Well, what he does is he puts pressure on a defense that makes you collapse and you kick out for threes. And with NBA shooting, that's a huge asset. The other thing is he's 6'8". He's got positional size. He's huge, and he uses his size to his advantage. He's good in the half court, and he's good in the full and in transition game. And defensively, he competes. Sometimes you get players that are taller and they're good offensively using their size. I mean, the best example of this is Luka Doncic. Obviously, I'm not saying Anthony Black is close to Luka Doncic, but he uses his size offensively, doesn't use his size defensively very well. And I think Anthony Black uses his tools defensively very well. So he'd be the first person that I feel like I would be neglecting my responsibility of saying who has improved their stock the most based off these tournaments.
For me, I almost put down Anthony Black, and I'm kind of glad I didn't, because I didn't want us to be talking about the same guy, especially since we already talked about him. But it's a really nice development that we've seen from him with some of that defensive versatility and offensive game. And the player I want to talk about is a little bit similar in the sense that defensive versatility is kind of really what has stood out for him, and that's Jarace Walker from the Houston Cougars. And of course, he was already a player that was being talked about really highly coming into the draft. There are some places that have him as a top 5 potential pick, certainly in the lottery conversation now. But again, 6'8" forward, kind of a Swiss Army knife defensively, can block shots, can play defense away from the rim. We've seen the offensive game show up in a big way too. A solid outside shooter, efficient around the rim, good rebounder, all of that stuff. We saw a fun Euro step move from him in that Texas Southern game. Houston hasn't played a ton of elite level competition yet, and so that is something to keep an eye on with him. You mentioned Creighton maybe doesn't have the most elite guards, but that's still a better opponent for Anthony Black to have faced than what Houston faced Oregon and Kel'el Ware, but haven't really faced a huge competition yet. So I'll be curious to see what Walker looks like as they get into some more of their tougher competition, either non-conference or even some of the tougher teams they'll face in conference. But Walker's a guy who's really impressed me so far this season.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I had 2 guys in the positive that are trending positive. It was Anthony Black and Jarace Walker, and then I've got a 1 for the negative.
Yeah,
and we already talked a little bit about Arthur Kaluma, so I'll state that I think he needs to work heavily on his shot and his shot creation. Jordan Walsh really gave him trouble. He dribbled so much to get very little. And I think he's almost kind of the odd man out. But to give one that's not Creighton and Arkansas centric, and this is a bit of a surprise, someone that could still be a top 10 pick. But I've been a little disappointed in the play of Keyonte George so far. Granted, it's been very good competition, but I feel like in a sense he's a bit of the odd man out in the backcourt in Waco, because Adam Flagler may be the best shooter in college basketball. I've been pumping that train for a little while.
Yeah.
And then LJ Cryer certainly isn't far back, and they've kind of alternated who's the lead guard. And Keyonte George is almost playing like a tertiary guard role, even though his best ability is to score the ball. So I think with time he's going to improve his stock. But if we're going just to kind of instant reaction off of little tournaments, and that was probably the best tournament, the Continental Tire one with Virginia winning it over Illinois, Baylor, and UCLA playing in a consolation game. Yeah. But that's elite competition. So it's hard to be a freshman, but you know what? That's our job to kind of make snap reactions on, well, he's playing as good a competition as you can play. He had Reese Beekman guarding him, and he's an NBA caliber defender easily. And I think you can make a case that Tiger Campbell and Clark for UCLA are borderline NBA defenders. And you could see uncomfortability for Keyonte George playing off the ball as much as he was. His shot is going to be good, but he looks a little rusty, and he's been a little rigid attacking the rim, handling the pressure of collegiate guards. So a minor stock down on Keyonte George for me.
Yeah, I'm with you on that too. And I had the helium for me, at least, about Keyonte George was really high coming into the season. So him not quite meeting the expectations that I had feels okay, because they were really high, but he's still got a lot of season to go. But I'm with you on some of those early season struggles. The guy that I mentioned, I touched on him very briefly when talking about Walker, is Kel'el Ware from Oregon. And again, maybe a guy that I was a little too high on coming into the season. And he hasn't been awful necessarily. Oregon themselves haven't played very well, and that has probably hurt his reputation a little bit. He just hasn't been really a go-to scorer for them. They've relied more on N'Faly Dante in the post. They've relied a little bit more on Will Richardson. And looking at Ware's numbers so far, he basically has had one very good game, and it was against Montana State. 7 for 12 from the field in that one, 2 of 3 from deep, which is really nice. For the rest of the season against Florida A&M, UC Irvine, and Houston, if you combine those games, I think he's 3 of 11 from the field. He's 1 of 5 from deep. Like he hasn't done much in those games. He was basically a non-factor against Houston, really the only quality program that Oregon has played so far. And to be clear, Houston is an elite defensive team and a challenging matchup for anybody. But for Ware to not really step up in a significant way in that game, he had 8 points in the season opener against A&M, missed most of his shots. Like I think he's a bit more of a project, and you can see the shot blocking skill. You can see the outside shooting skill. You can see why there's some appeal in a player who's 7 feet tall, who can do the stuff that he can do. But I'm not quite sure that all the pieces have been put together yet. And Oregon, quite frankly, has had a reputation of getting some very high-level recruits that haven't quite reached that. N'Faly Dante was a high-level recruit. Bol has played very well in the NBA lately, but, it took some time for him to kind of be that level of player. And Ware just gives me a little bit of similar vibes, and so far the early returns haven't been fantastic for him. He'll get some good opportunities as Oregon, certainly in the PK 85 against UConn, and as they get into Pac-12 play. But for right now, the early returns are not great for me on Kel'el Ware.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I think he's in a similar boat, but maybe even a worse off boat than a guy like Keyonte George or Arthur Kaluma, because they're playing second fiddle, third fiddle to players in their same position group.
Right.
And N'Faly Dante appears to have taken that leap against Houston. He make an argument he was the best player on that court, including Jarace Walker, including Mark Sasser, Tremont Mark, all these guys. And I would say that was a strong contention. He was the best player on the court. So it's hard for Kel'el Ware to play his true position when the player ahead of him is a highly regarded center in his own regard. And they've tried to embrace like jumbo, like they're playing 3 bigs. Like Nate Biddle is 7 feet tall.
Yeah.
Quincy Guerrier played basically the 5 on defense for Syracuse. I guess he played the 4 because they had Merrick Dolezaj, but he was bigger than Merrick Dolezaj. Long story short, they're huge. So he's having to embrace responsibilities that are hard for an 18-year-old freshman to do.
Sure.
But that was someone I had tempered expectations for. I guess I was a little bit on the lower end of the spectrum coming into the season. But I still would say overall his stock watch is down because he's such a project and he was regarded as one coming in. But it's just worse now because of the fact that there's these expectations and he's got a logjam at position.
Yep.
And it's just a difficult situation. There's always a couple players like that, and there's plenty more on good teams that are behind quality players that are veterans.
Well, Leif, I want to transition for the final part of the show to talk about some of the games coming up. There are, so many games that we could talk about, that we could pick, that we could kind of discuss. What I want to do here is a segment we're going to continue to move forward with on a Locked On College Basketball podcast called Upset Watch. We're going to look at a couple of games that are coming up in the next 2, 3, 4 days that we think have the potential for there to be an upset. We haven't clearly defined upset. It doesn't necessarily have to be a top 25 team losing to a team of a certain caliber. Just any game where we think that the team not favored could end up winning. Obviously, this season has been incredibly difficult to predict. I have watched a lot of Colorado basketball. I cannot imagine expecting their season to have gone the way that it has, with some of the wins and some of the losses that they have incurred already this season. But I did look at a few games here that I think could potentially have the potential for some upsets. Before we get into some of mine, I'm curious if there's a game or a couple games that you are looking at coming up, Leif, that you think might have a result different than what the expectations are.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because a lot of the potential matchups have yet to be set because they're in tournaments. So I'll put that out there for those of you listening that we don't know all the matchups. One that's caught my eye a little bit in the PK 85 is Purdue and West Virginia.
Yeah,
I don't think West Virginia is a great team this year. They're not like a typical Huggins team, but Purdue is really having some transitions. They've had Jaden Ivey, they've had Travion Williams as kind of their focal points of their offense. Now they have Zach Edey, and he's a beast, 7'4", 290, and he's actually pretty mobile. Like, he's going to be a load to deal with. But their guard play is questionable. Their wing play is questionable. And if any team can expose that, that's West Virginia when they become press Virginia. And I think Bob Huggins will orchestrate that, becoming it and push the pace and make Edey less of a factor than they typically would be. So would I bet on that game? I'm not sure. But I think that's a pretty good upset spot for a program that's kind of in a down year, and it's been in a down year for West Virginia.
I tell you what, Gonzaga fans would love to get a chance to play West Virginia in that one. Clearly, Purdue is probably the better team in terms of helping their resume. But Bob Huggins has said some not so nice things about Gonzaga and how they would be shocked joining the Big 12. And Gonzaga fans always love playing Bob Huggins. They've defeated him in the NCAA tournament before. And so I think that would be a really fun Friday evening matchup to potentially get. Although certainly Gonzaga and Purdue, Edey versus Timmy, would be a pretty fun one too. The upset that I had on my calendar is the number 15 ranked Auburn Tigers playing St. Louis Billikens. That game is scheduled on the 27th at noon Pacific time. Again, I think this is just the kind of team. St. Louis is a good team. They already have wins over Providence. They have wins over Memphis. They got beat by Maryland, so they've proven that they can drop some games too. But Yuri Collins is just a really, really tough player. 15 points, 10 assists per game. He's one of the best passers in all of college basketball. St. Louis has a top 15 offense in the country per KenPom. I think Auburn is very good, and Auburn has proven that even with the losses of Jabari Smith and Walker Kessler, they're still a team that's going to be a force to be reckoned with in the SEC. Wendell Green is fantastic. He's been really good to start the season. Jonai Broom is a very good player as well, 12-9 for him early on in the season. I'm not a huge KD Johnson fan. I think he's shown some turnover to issues in the past, and I think that St. Louis, with their high-octane offense and with a couple already good wins under their belt, I think they have the opportunity to pull off a pretty big win here, take down a top 15 team in Auburn, and potentially position themselves to be at least a team under consideration for a top 25 spot heading into December.
Yeah, I like that one. Yuri Collins is, some upsets in March Madness are often classified as, do you have the best guards and can you hit threes? Well, they can do both, so they've got a chance.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've got a few more that I wouldn't qualify as enormous upsets, but they're the lower seed winning, and this is because PK 85 has such top-heavy teams.
Yeah.
I think Oregon could beat UConn. They've got the length to disrupt. UConn's number 20 in the country right now, and Oregon's unranked. They've got the length to make it hard on Adama Sanogo. Andre Jackson's coming back from injury. Jordan Hawkins is coming back from injury. So two of their best three players aren't fully right, and the rest are fairly unproven. And Fali Dante is as good a matchup as you can create for Adama Sanogo. Florida, I think, can beat Xavier. Xavier is the higher ranked team in KenPom and was just ranked in the AP poll as of last week. And Bama, I think, will beat Michigan State, though Michigan State's playing really hard. Yeah, Alabama's got the pace and the scoring ability that I think will be difficult to overcome for Michigan State. That best attribute is a great one. It's determination and tenacity, but it's hard to get stops when you're playing at the breakneck speed that Alabama's going to play, especially with a player like Brandon Miller, who I think is going to be a freshman All-American.
Absolutely. It's funny. The Alabama-Michigan State game wouldn't be considered an upset like a week ago. But now, because of that hot start to the season that Michigan State has had, it does look like it. That's going to be a really fun game, I think, for me. Like, those two teams are both very, very good. Michigan State has played extraordinary to start the season. Mady Sissoko has looked just outstanding for Tom Izzo early in the year. But that's going to be a really interesting matchup based on those two teams' strengths. For me, the next game that I wanted to talk about is coming up in a couple days. That is the Clemson versus Iowa game. Again, Iowa is 25th. They're barely ranked in the top 25. Clemson is a very quality Power 5 program, so it doesn't feel like a tremendous upset necessarily, but I could see Clemson pulling that one off. They're just a balanced team. They're a good offensive team and a decent defensive team. They don't really have any big wins yet. They haven't been super tested, which is part of the, can they rise to the challenge and beat a good Hawkeyes team? They lost to South Carolina. The rest of their wins are not anything to write home about necessarily. Iowa's a good team, but they're not a great team defensively. And I think Clemson has the ability to potentially do some damage. Chase Hunter has been an elite scorer so far this season. Hunter Tyson has been a monster on the boards, just about 10 rebounds per game for him. This is a team that can shoot it, can really shoot it, shooting 39% from deep so far on the season for Clemson. And I think that if they come into this game, if Hunter has a good game, if they shoot the rock well, if Iowa struggles a bit defensively, I could see them picking up a nice victory here.
Yeah, Iowa's an interesting team because when they get hot, they're very difficult to beat. If they ever go cold, they're susceptible.
Yeah.
So I like that pick. And then I listed a couple, so I'll read the rationales, I guess, for the ones we talked about: Michigan State and Alabama. Mm-hmm. I briefly talked about Oregon and UConn, but the one that I didn't mention was Florida and Xavier. Florida has probably the best big in that game, despite Xavier having two very good all-conference caliber bigs in the Big East, in Zach Freemantle and Jack Nunge. Colin Castleton's the best big on that court. They've got elite athleticism and Alex Fudge on the wings. I really am a huge believer in Todd Golden. I think when he was at San Francisco, he was one of the best coaches in the country, and no one knew about him. You probably did as a West Coast Conference guy. But, this is a long been a guy that I think has been deserving of a promotion. And at Florida, I think he's got them trending in the right direction. They also have veteran guards. It's just acclimating to new teammates that I think is the big thing for Florida. They fell in KenPom and in like deep AP polls that weren't like ranked, but they were considered on the fringe because they dropped one game. But I think their quality is far better than what people have seen so far, and so I think this is an opportunity for a statement win and something kind of to get a catapulting or just to become a catalyst for an impressive season for Florida, because the SEC is really good. But there's no team other than Kentucky, Arkansas, and maybe Tennessee that really scares you like a ton. And I think there's 4 through 8 is wide open in the SEC, and I think Florida's got a really good claim that no one really has spoken about so far. So that's one I wanted to analyze a little bit. And it was not a huge upset, and I'm fully willing to admit that. But it's one that I think that Xavier certainly will be favored in the game.
Yeah. Absolutely. Leif, thank you so much for coming on the show today. That is going to do it for us. Happy Thanksgiving to those of you out there listening on the holiday. So many great basketball games coming your way. So excited for us to get the opportunity to continue to give you reactions to those games, previews, upsets, all of that stuff going forward. Check out the show wherever you already get podcasts. Go find it on YouTube and hit that subscribe button. Enjoy the holiday and enjoy all of the MTEs this week.